things that I have been seeing a lot when I try to do research on really good portfolios is how people kind of organize their thoughts into headers. And so I'm going to go on the point that we made where we say that you do need to have attention grabbing headers, but you don't need to plainly emphasize different steps in your process. Oh, background, that's the biggest thing. And then there's a huge paragraph after background, and then research, and then everything else is smaller. We were talking about that hierarchy. So I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about that and the different examples, both good and bad, that you've experienced and have seen.
Totally. I mean, and also to be fully transparent, I don't think it's actually a bad thing. I think it's just, it's just average. I've seen the average person do this where they just put for each header, problem statement, solution, research. And I mean these verbatim, that is verbatim what headers are, right? User research, brainstorming session, which is something that I permanently believe shouldn't go on the case study at all, but that's a different topic. But yeah, basically very clinical almost headers where, yes, it's very clear what you did. But again, this goes all the way back to the fact that recruiters don't spend more than 5 to 10 minutes on your site. And so if you can optimize their reading experience by telling them the entire story without reading a single paragraph, that is literally the ideal scenario, because then all they can do is read the headers, get that full story, look at the pretty images that you put up, done, move on to the next case study that you put up. Because honestly, if they're going to spend the full 5 minutes on one case study and it happens to be a case study that has nothing to do with the company, then you're screwed, right? Yeah. But you want them to read as many case studies as possible. So, 2 minutes per case study, ideal. Then they can get to 2 to 3 case studies. You maximize your chances.
They're not going to spend a lot of time on your site. So you better highlight the so what portion that we were talking about. So that's for sure something that was really helpful for me to understand. Now, I want to talk about the one thing that I feel was the biggest thing that I also learned in our portfolio review session, which was you do need to show that you thought about how your solution is measurable, but you don't necessarily need to have tests completed. And the reason why I highlight this as probably the biggest point that I learned a lot about is because as a student, basically all of the projects that I have are all hypothetical. Sure, I went out to do things, but the product didn't actually came into fruition in the real world. I'm a little bit curious about how you see people not doing this well or not doing it at all, and why you think it's important as well.
So I mean, I can probably break it down into two kind of separate segments, to be honest, because one segment is almost all about why it's important to measure your success for your project, and then another section is basically okay, but what happens if your project never went out the door, right? You didn't ship it, you didn't test it. And so for those hypothetical projects that you mentioned, what do we do then? So it's almost like two different conversations.
Yeah.
And so for the first part, let's just ignore the fact that, this is a hypothetical project and you are just writing a case study for an app that you made, right? 90% of the time, what I see at the bottom of that case study is basically hey, I did some usability tests. Here are a couple quotes on all the ways that people love this new design over the old one. And that is basically just a summary of your qualitative results, right? It's just a bunch of people saying they loved your app, which is awesome. I'm not trying to discount the value that qualitative insight really brings, but if you really think about it from the point of view of the person who's hiring you, who is basically working for a company that is led by people who are business savvy, right? These business savvy people are at the end of the day trying to make more money, reduce costs, whatever. And all of these outcomes are always measurable, always. Business is almost always quantifiable. And so in order for you to prove your value to them, you have to speak in that exact same terminology. So you have to say, exactly in numerical terms, how did your solution bring value to the business? And so some amazing examples that I've seen are basically like, you know, I was able to convert users, increase that conversion rate to 200%. And conversion can mean different things. Like conversion could mean, for example, going from landing page to a successful sale, right? I was able to increase that by 200% because of this better checkout flow that I designed. You know, that is amazing. That is absolutely amazing. If you design a checkout flow and you don't talk about conversion rates, it's almost like, okay, why does it matter that they were able to enter their credit card in a, you know, in a friendlier, more usable way? Because it allows them to check out more or faster. It doesn't frustrate them and make them drop off from the checkout experience, and then you have lost the sale, right? And so that's why, even though I'm talking about, you know, something that seems to be super important once you're in the company, you still have to prove that you have that muscle before you enter the company, which is basically talking about how you measure success in very quantifiable terms.
Right.
And so moving on to the other portion of what happens when your project is completely hypothetical, in that case, okay, so in that case, you can't get the actual number. You can't say I increased conversion by X%, but you can still say, if I did launch this app, I would be looking at conversion rates. And even though it doesn't get you all the way to the finish line, it at least gets you like, you know, 70% of the way there. Because again, most people with hypothetical projects never even mention it because they don't have those numbers. But something is really better than nothing, because to a company, they'll see that and be like, oh, okay, so at least she's thinking about it in terms of the business context. She knows what's important. She knows how to measure the impact of her own work. And so, yeah, like I want to hire her, you know, versus another person looking at your portfolio and being like, oh, this is a thought experiment, so I'm just not going to care.
You're essentially persuading. Perhaps like recruiters can't necessarily get like the most out of like, oh, this like single design choice that you made, but the fact that you have something that everyone can relate to, which are numbers and like successful numbers, I think that that's like the key to being able to get that, like, it's almost like a cherry on top of like your case study, right? Like honestly, if I didn't talk to you about it, I probably wouldn't have thought about it. So yeah.
No, it's totally all right. I think that honestly, again, like I keep emphasizing that a lot of this really is not your fault. It's not the fault of like a junior designer, that like, how did you not know this from the start? It's more like just the way that we teach junior designers to advance in their career is basically telling them, okay, at the very beginning, here is the structure, which always comes in the form of design thinking model, right? It's just like, here are the da-da-da steps you have to follow always. And then once they are able to break out of that, then we're like, okay, also now like I want you to focus on your craft, because your interaction design's not there yet, or your visual design's not there yet, or like blah, blah, blah. These are skill sets that you have gaps in, and so I need you to focus on your craft. But then we have this blind spot of what I'm talking about. You're not thinking about the bigger picture, you're not thinking about the strategy. And so honestly, like, I guess all I'm trying to do is just emphasize the fact that from my perspective, I think that the way that we're teaching designers is a little bit broken. And so, you know, all I want to do is just, you know, open some room for discussion around other things that you should keep your eye on, and make sure that you're not turning a blind eye to it until it's too late, or until you're asking for that promote and your boss is just like, well, I mean, you made everything look pretty, which is really nice for the company, but I mean, that's no reason to give you a promotion, which sucks.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that this idea of like filling in the gaps of what has been taught to us is something that I have also been seeing. Like, I think that in a way I've been learning as much as I am from school, from these things in LinkedIn, these articles that are coming up, these conversations that are coming up. And I think that it's cool to see that, you know, the more you aren't afraid to like go beyond the steps of design thinking, the more well-rounded you are as a designer. Like, you're not just going to be designing, you're also thinking about it in these different ways. that's definitely something that will stick with me. And I believe the final thing, this idea of personalizing your portfolio for every company that you apply to. And I think that personally, like, I've seen many people do this really well, and I've seen like workshops on this. I think that the reason why I asked you about this was like, I'm in that position where I'm about to apply to all these different jobs post-grad. And I'm like, okay, I need to, like, there's this whole list of companies that I want to apply to. Like, do I actually have to make a personalized version of my portfolio for them? And I was like, oh no, I was scared to hear your answer. But then your answer actually caught me off guard. And I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I feel like I have such a strong opinion on this one. Again, I guess like throw that caveat in there. I have a very strong opinion on it. Hopefully people agree with me. But I'm coming at this answer from a couple of different ways. Number one, historically, from what I've seen, think about personalizing your portfolio per company, analogous to the idea of like dropping out of college. You know, like Steve Jobs dropped out of college and he became this, you know, super successful person. But what that means is like, can it be successful? Yes. Is it probable? No. And it's probably maybe also like a not a great way to use your time. And so like that's what I kind of always compare to. So, you know, I've seen people obviously get hired and get attention from a company because they made their entire portfolio tailored to that company, but that is like one out of maybe thousands of people. And so I don't recommend it to everybody, because then 999 people would be wasting their time. But the other side that I'm really coming at this from is that from the recruiter and hiring manager perspective, I feel very strongly that putting weight in something like this is catering to people who are more privileged. Because what I mean by that is that doing this kind of work takes so much time, like an absolute, you know, mind splintering amount of time. And so not a lot of people can afford that. People are looking for jobs in their free time. And so in their other time, they're working, they're paying the bills. And so if you're asking that every candidate has to do this in order to get your attention, that's incredibly unfair, because not a lot of people can afford to do that in their spare time. And so you're already biasing towards people who are a little bit more privileged, who already have, you know, financial stability or home stability in any sort of way. And so I guess my strong opinion really also applies to not only the candidate side of things, but also the hiring side of things. I really truly believe that recruiters and hiring managers should never take stuff like this into account, because, you know, that's just, I don't know, that's just bringing in bias that we shouldn't be having in the first place.
Right. Boy, am I grateful. that's not something that is expected of me, because I can't even imagine, like, you know, it kind of goes back to one of the first things, which is prioritization. And I think that above everything else, the key to creating your portfolio is to get you hired because you do good work. That's like all of the questions that or the topics that we needed to cover. But I guess I'm just curious to know if you were talking to you before you got your first job in product design, and you had like not just necessarily one sentence, but like a few things to tell yourself, what would those things be?
Okay.
And it can be like, whether it's like technical support, emotional support, you know, that I'd like to know kind of what you would tell yourself. And I'm sure that could apply to, you know, a lot of other people.
Certainly, I feel like I'm just going to be reiterating a lot of the things that we already talked about, but certainly portfolio building wise, you need to really take the path of least resistance. You know, stop building work for yourself that honestly does not provide that value that we were saying. I think this is coming from myself as a background where I was a developer first before I was a designer. And so I spent absolute months, you know, coding my own portfolio site to perfection. And so that was just not a good use of time. So don't do that. And then I think the other piece of advice I probably would have given myself is I should have have reached out to people more, and by people I mean mentors, peers, colleagues, whatever, and asked them for objective feedback, objective, productive feedback. Because I do feel like, although I, of course, signed up for sessions with people who were in the field for a long time, I never really made the most out of those sessions. You know, all I did was just kind of sit there and be like, hey, so what's the secret to success? I don't know, you know, like these like big lofty questions that kind of get you nowhere. I wish I was more intentional in the way that I asked for feedback. And obviously I also wish I did it more. You regardless of how productive or how intentional you went about that feedback, more is always just better. Just always get feedback. But, you know, given that you have a bunch of it, I wish that I could really be intentional about, okay, I'm going to ask how this person views my abilities as a, for example, visual designer, visual only. Let's just assess my visual skills and see across, you know, 5 different people how they perceive my competency in that area. And I can tell you right now, after, you know, years of experience, my visual skills are not great, you know, and I wish I knew that earlier. I wish that I would have, 1, acknowledged that earlier, and then 2, to have a conversation with myself about whether that's okay, you know. And I did. I had that conversation. I was like, yeah, that's okay. I'm never going to be a visual designer because it's not something I'm interested in. But having that conversation with yourself, you know, builds this path of being more self-aware. And basically next time you go into your job interview and they point out that you're not very good at visual design, I'm going to be like, yes, because my goals are to be a more strategic designer. And so I apply to you knowing that you value that. So I am personally okay with not being visually strong, and I acknowledge that fully. So like, let's just go from there and not, you know, suffer from a really awkward interview where I start sweating and being like, oh, I'm not good in every area. Right. So yes, that's a very long-winded, I know you asked for a couple sentences, very long and winded answer.
No, yeah, I think that's very helpful, and I hope that, you know, in the same way that you've like enlightened me with like more of just calm down, you're doing fine, this is what you need to do and you'll be okay. I hope that this will also kind of come across to whoever watches this. Thank you so much for going over all of that with me.
For sure. It's always absolute pleasure talking to you. I'm really looking forward to the next time we have a chat, recorded or not.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, it probably won't be recorded. Thank you so much, Lily, for your time. And to everybody, I'll make sure to link in her information in the description, and make sure to stay tuned to the next Design Diaries. But thank you, Lily.
Thank you, Leah.